Amen. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, to get a historical context for the book of Lamentations, we have to see the fall of Jerusalem under the Chaldeans, also known as the Babylonians. So to see why Jeremiah is lamenting, why he is sad, and by inspiration writing about the fall of Jerusalem, let's see what we have here as a summation in 2 Chronicles 36, beginning in verse 15. And it says, "The Lord God of their fathers sent warnings to them by His messengers, rising up early and sending them, because He had compassion on His people and on His dwelling place." This is talking about, of course, God, the God of their ancestors, loved them and was patient with them and sent His messengers to warn them of the sin that they were committing, and that the doom and the punishment that was coming upon the nation if they did not repent. And because His dwelling place was there in Jerusalem. What's that talking about? Church building? Is there a church building there in Jerusalem? Temple. That's where the temple, Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem. If you haven't noticed my mode of operation, I'll just all of a sudden pop out with a question. So you gotta be paying attention, because the question I have a pop question any place. There's no rhyme and reason to it. It'll just happen. So that also keeps you on your toes, see. So the house of the Lord, the dwelling place of God's people, is found in Jerusalem. So He loved His people. The dwelling place was there. And therefore He wanted to warn His people. But here's how they treated the prophets. Verse 16. They mocked the messengers of God, despised His words, scoffed at His prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against His people, till there was no remedy. That's a very ominous phrase. Till there was no remedy. In other words, there was no more hope. A nation can get to the point where it's irretrievable. There's no more hope. And this is where His people, His own people, this is how far they went. And they despised the messengers that God sent. Those messengers were sent to tell the people to repent. You've got to change. You've got to come back from the path that you're going down. Verse 17, "Therefore He brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, had no compassion on the young men or the virgin, on the aged or on the weak. He gave them into his hand." Who was the king of the Chaldeans? Nebuchadnezzar. He was the king of the Chaldeans. What's another name for the Chaldeans? The Babylonians. So the Babylonians, or Chaldeans, were the people that God raised up. He brought against them. See, God in His providence was doing this. You see, Nebuchadnezzar was just doing this because he wanted to, because he wanted to conquer people and wanted the wealth of that nation and wanted the tribute of that nation. He had no clue that God was using him for His purposes. And that's how providence works. Verse 18, "All the articles from the house of God, great and small, the treasure of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king and his leaders, all these He took to Babylon." So all the precious implements that were used in the temple, you read about them being built for the tabernacle in the book of Leviticus. The precious golden items that were used, that were built by Solomon during the time that Solomon built the temple, all of those things were taken, and they were taken back to Babylon. Verse 19. Then they burned the house of God, that's the temple, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all of its palaces with fire, and destroyed all of its precious possessions. So here the great temple that Solomon had built is now being destroyed by the Babylonians. Verse 20. Those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became his servants to him, to his sons, until the rule of the kingdom of Persia. Those who escaped the sword, in other words, they didn't die, he took to be his servants in Babylon. Can you name some of them? Daniel, his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Ezekiel. They were some of the captives that escaped the sword. Now Ezekiel was among the captives, the common people as it were, and Daniel and his friends were high quality, so they get to serve Nebuchadnezzar in the palace. And verse 21 says, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths, as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. 70 years. And so to enjoy the Sabbaths, a period of Sabbaths. And one of the reasons why 70 years was because they were violating the Sabbath. One of the things that you see in the prophets is how they would still do business on the Sabbath. They would still engage in their commercial affairs on the Sabbath. And so that's part of the reason for the 70 years as well. And then verse 21 through 23, we see that the period of Ezra and Nehemiah are being depicted when the people after 70 years get to come back under the decree of Cyrus. So in 586 BC, the people of God, they're in Jerusalem and Judah, they're taken into captivity. The temple is destroyed. The city is destroyed. And it is said that Jeremiah witnessed that. Some say that he saw that from a distance, what was happening in Jerusalem, and he wrote Lamentations. And Lamentations, of course, refers to one who laments. You're sad about something, you're expressing that in Lamentations. And it is called the funeral dirge of Jerusalem, because he is seeing Jerusalem be destroyed and be killed, as it were. And it's one of the saddest books that you'll find in the Bible. But there are, of course, highlights and positive things within this sad book. It's interesting that Jeremiah writes this, and he writes this as a poem that uses 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet in the first 4 chapters. So it's an acrostic that uses the Hebrew alphabet by which the people could memorize each point in the poetry that he's writing by inspiration. It was a memory tool. Each letter had a series of verses that went along with it. Now the 5th chapter is different. It's not part of the Hebrew lettering. And so we see this very sad book, but there are some great lessons that are found therein. In fact, one of the songs that we sing is found in Lamentation 3 and verse 22. Lamentation chapter 3, verse 22. Through the Lord's mercy we are not consumed, but His compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in Him. We sing that song. And it goes on to say in verse 25, the Lord is good to those who wait for Him, to the soul who seeks Him. It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth. So there are some positive things within this very sad book. But the point that we see in this sad book is God fulfills His promise when He says, this nation I'm finished with. And He brought about destruction, even though a remnant did survive according to the promise. So we see here this sad funeral dirge for Jerusalem. And that's what we're going to see in this book. It's interesting that chapter 1 has 22 verses. Chapter 2 has 22 verses. Chapter 3 has 66 verses. Chapter 4 has 22 verses. And chapter 5 has 22 verses. I don't know the significance of that. I just thought that was interesting. A little bit of trivia there. But it's a very powerful book, and we don't oftentimes read the entire book of Lamentation. We know that verse in there that we often sing as a song about God's blessings and mercies that are new every morning. But it's good to see verses within the context of the book it's found. And we're going to learn a lot about God and how that God, even though is patient and long-suffering toward His people, He does not tolerate sin. And we should not confuse God's patience with tolerance. And I think that's the problem that the people of Israel had. They thought God's patience meant He put up with what they were doing. And that was not it at all. So we see here, beginning in chapter 1 and verse 1, before we get into the text, we hear the expression, of course there's a song about it that says, sad songs say so much. And that is the purpose of poetry and expressing oneself in sad laments or songs. What are very popular songs that express ourselves? Do we not express ourselves in sad songs? A person will go through a breakup or go through a terrible tragedy of their life. What will they do? They'll put pen to paper. They'll write a poetry about it, and they'll sing it. And some of the greatest hits of our culture are based upon tragedy, terrible things that have happened. And so the human psyche has to express itself in poetry or in song. And God, the Holy Spirit, is using Jeremiah in his sorrow. He's called the weeping prophet. Using Jeremiah in his sorrow to write this book by inspiration as Jeremiah is lamenting over what is happening to his people, to Jerusalem, and to the temple. And you often find this in the Psalms. You go throughout the Psalms and David will express himself, by inspiration of course, in the Psalm talking about being surrounded by enemies, feeling alone, feeling like he is forsaken. And that is the nature of poetry. Chapter 1 and beginning in verse 1. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow is she who was great among the nations. The princess among the province has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks among all her lovers. She has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Verse 3, Judah has gone into captivity under affliction and hard servitude. She dwells among the nations. She finds no rest. All her persecutors overtake her in dire straits. The roads to Zion mourn because no one comes to the set feast. All her gates are desolate. Her priests sigh. Her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness. So we see here that Jeremiah is talking about the city, how it is lonely. It was once full of people. Once a full and prosperous city, now it is lonely. It was great among the nations. In fact, the fame of Jerusalem went so far as the Queen of Sheba, right? Did she not come up hearing about Solomon and his wisdom and then express the half hasn't been told? So the fame of Jerusalem went throughout the world at one point. I believe that Israel was at its zenith during the reign of Solomon. He received, in our currency estimation, billions of dollars of tribute from those who were around him. And the expense of the temple he built was in the billion-dollar range in our currency numbering system. It was at the height of power during Solomon. And now that temple is being destroyed. That great city that was at one time people from all around would come to see and see the temple is now destroyed. It's become a slave. The prince among the province has become a slave. It talks about in verse 2, she weeps bitterly in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks among all her lovers. She has no comfort to her. There's no comfort. Those idols that she trusted in, she personifying Jerusalem, they don't comfort her anymore. Those idols that she prayed to, that they worshipped, they don't bring comfort. And God said that when I come, I'm going to destroy those idols, and those things that you trust in are going to be done away with. So it depicts here very clearly the sad, deplorable condition they are in. Verse 3, Judah has gone into captivity and to hard servitude. She will dwell among the nations. That's referring to the Gentiles. She's going to be among the Gentile people. She will find no rest. All her persecutors overtake her in dire straits. So this is the captivity of God's people. And they have gone as a result of their own sin. Then verse 4 talks about the roads to Zion. That's referring to Jerusalem. Zion is another name for Jerusalem. There's no set feast. All those feasts and those sacrifices come to an end in Jerusalem. Her gates are desolate. So there's no business transaction. That's where you would do your business and your transaction. And your trade oftentimes would be taking place at the gate of a city. Well, they're desolate now. Her priests have sighed and her virgins are afflicted. She is in bitterness. Any questions or comments at this point before we go any further? Who do they have to blame for this? Themselves. Themselves. I was watching a series of documentaries on the Learning Channel yesterday about women in prison, women getting arrested. Very interesting study of human nature. And a few of them would admit they were in there because they did it. Some would blame everyone else but themselves. But some of them came to grips to the realization that they were in there as a result of the choices they made and the people they affiliated themselves with. And that's exactly the problem with Judah and Jerusalem. The choices they made because of the nations they affiliated themselves with, because they wanted to be like the nations around about them, wanted to be like everyone else, everyone's doing it, that mentality, has got them into this problem. And so we bring upon ourselves tragedy and problems. Verse 5, her adversaries have become the masters. Her enemies prosper, for the Lord or Yahweh has afflicted her because of the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone into captivity before the enemy. So it is Yahweh or the Lord who has afflicted her. But He has done this providentially. He's afflicting her by allowing the Chaldeans to come in and take them captive. But it is the Lord who is behind that. Verse 6, and from the daughter of Zion all her splendor has departed. Her princes have become like deer that find no pasture, that flee without strength before the pursuer. In the days of her affliction and her roaming, Jerusalem remembers all her pleasant things that she had in the days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the enemy, with no one to help her. The adversary saw her and mocked her at her downfall. the days of old, talking about the good old days, so to speak, the days when they had so much, when they prospered. And as a result of that, they became, as we saw, complacent. Complacent in their prosperity and very comfortable in their situation. I want to put together a sermon called An Inconvenient Religion. And I haven't put it all together yet. But people want a complacent, convenient religion. Nothing that inconveniences them at all, that makes any demands at all. And that's how the people were in the days of Israel. They wanted something that was like everyone else. They didn't want to be different than the other nations. And they took the easy way out in going with the flow. And as a result, it led to their downfall. Verse 8, Jerusalem has sinned gravely. Therefore she has become vile. All who honored her despise her, because they have seen her nakedness. Yes, she sighs and turns away. Notice here it talks about what Jerusalem is doing, sin gravely. Excuse me. She's become vile. There in verse 8. That refers to something that is totally unclean, that's filthy, morally speaking. All who honored her despised her, because they have seen her nakedness. Yes, she sighs and turns away. Her uncleanness is in her skirts. She did not consider her destiny. Therefore, her collapse was awesome. She had no comforter. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy is exalted. Verse 10, the adversary has pinned his hand over all her pleasant things. For she has seen the nations enter her sanctuary, those whom you commanded not to enter your assembly. Now, look at verse 10. The nations have entered her sanctuary, those you commanded not to enter into the assembly. What is that referring to? Who entered into the sanctuary, the temple? That was not supposed to be there. Nebuchadnezzar, exactly. They were the ones that entered in to take out all the stuff. They're not supposed to be in there according to God's will, according to the law. The Gentiles are not supposed to go in there. So they have gone in. And they have defiled the sanctuary, those who were not commanded to go in. Verse 11, all her people sigh. They seek bread. They have given their valuables for food to restore life. So, O Lord, consider, for I am scorned. Verse 12, is it nothing to you, all who pass by? Behold and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which has been brought on me, which the Lord has afflicted in the day of his fierce anger. Is it nothing to you, all who pass by? All who are passing by, figuratively speaking, and watching what's happening to Jerusalem, is that just nothing to you? And of course, Jerusalem is being personified here as saying this. And the imagery here is saying, this which is brought upon me, which the Lord has inflicted in the day of his fierce anger. So here, the day of his fierce anger, the punishment upon Jerusalem has come, and therefore the question is asked, is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Verse 13, from above he has sent fire into my bones, and it overpowered them. He has spread a net for my feet and turned me back. He has made me desolate and faint all the day, expressing the terror that's come upon Jerusalem. Verse 14, the yoke of my transgression was bound. They were woven together by his hand and thrust upon my neck. He made my strength fail. The Lord delivered me into the hands of those whom I am not able to withstand. Yoke of my transgression was bound and placed upon my neck. So the symbolism there is of that yoke. And oftentimes when a conquering nation like Babylon or some other, they would put a literal yoke on the captives to restrain them, to have them under better control. So quite literally, a physical yoke would have been placed upon those who would have been marched off to captivity. But of course, it's because of the transgressions that yoke had come upon them. It's like saying to someone who's arrested, your transgressions have put you in handcuffs. Your transgressions have put you behind bars. And that's exactly what has happened. Verse 15. The Lord has trampled underfoot all my mighty men in my midst. He has called an assembly against me to crush my young men. The Lord trampled as in a winepress the virgin daughter of Judah. So just trampling underfoot as God is just trampling the city of Jerusalem using Nebuchadnezzar, just like someone would trample upon clusters of grapes within a winepress. Book of Revelation talks about the winepress of God's wrath, how it's going to be poured out, and of course the context there is on the Roman Empire for what they were doing to the church. Verse 16. For these things I weep, my eye overflow with water, because the Comforter who should restore my life is far from me. My children are desolate because the enemy prevailed. The eyes are overflowing with tears. Again, this indicates Jeremiah is the one doing this. Jeremiah 13 and verse 17 talks about him being the one who's weeping. He talks a lot about weeping. And so you see he's crying over what is happening to his people and to his nation. Verse 17. Zion spreads out her hands, but no one comforts her. The Lord has commanded concerning Jacob that those around him become his adversaries. Jerusalem has become an unclean thing among them. So Jerusalem, Jacob there, Zion, all referring to the city of Jerusalem and to God's people there. They had become an unclean thing. They had defiled themselves. They had become vile. And therefore here the punishment is coming. Verse 18. The Lord or Yahweh is righteous, for I rebelled against his commandment. Hear now, O all you people, and behold my sorrow. My virgins and my young men have gone into captivity. Now notice here, of course, Jerusalem again being personified. What was happening was from a righteous God. He's saying that God is righteous. He's doing what's right. Yahweh is righteous. For I rebelled against his commandment. So the fault does not lie upon God. The fault lies against the people, lies upon the people for disobeying God's will. So when God punishes, he's righteous in doing that. He's right in punishing those who deserve punishment. And when God was talking to Abraham, Abraham said, will not the judge of all the earth do right? And remember, Abraham was kind of bargaining for Sodom and Gomorrah. And the number kept dropping lower and lower. And God said, if you find this number, then I'll spare Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, they could not even find the bottom line number. And therefore that city was beyond remedy, beyond redemption, and he destroyed them. But in doing so, the point is, the Lord is righteous. The Lord is righteous when he blesses us and forgives and takes us to heaven someday. He's righteous when he does that. And the Lord is righteous when he punishes people in eternal fire in hell. He's righteous when he does that. That is the right thing to do. One time I was working with a lady, and we were talking about Bible things, and she said, you know, the Lord, He was just mean when He drowned all those people in the flood. That was just mean. And I said, no, that wasn't mean. That was righteous. So what about babies that died in the flood? What about innocent people that died in the flood? Well, they would have been taken to a better place. They die in innocence, they're going to go to heaven. But she just could not get that around in her thinking. She could not get it in her thought processes that it was a right thing for God to destroy the earth with water and save Noah. And so it's a conditioning of our society to think that only the pleasant things God does, that's righteous, but the things that may bring about terrible things, that's just not right. And we learn from this verse here that God is righteous, and those who fall as a result of rebellion, they're the ones that are at fault. They're the ones that are in sorrow. And so it's saying here in verse 18, behold my sorrow, my virgins and my young men have gone into captivity. Look at me as an example and learn from it. I think that's the message that we get. Romans 15 and verse 4, the things written aforetime were written for our learning. So we learn from these things. Any question or comment about that?
I think sometimes we forget as well the parallel of government as an authority to God's authority here on earth. We have passages. I was just reminding myself here in Romans 13.
Mm-hmm.
There is no authority except from God. The authorities exist. They're instituted by God. I know I'm guilty of something as simple as speeding, over the speeding limit. The laws that we have, and we live in a really good nation as it is. And we aren't in a place in the Middle East where there's no telling what we'd be subject to as a people. But we've been very blessed as American citizens, and yet we question. I know I do, and I know I feel like if I'm questioning it, then I know I can't be the only one, right?
Right.
And so it's a good reminder for us as Christians as well that if we rebel, there are consequences, and we should try to adhere to the laws as well.
Exactly. We want a righteous nation to have righteous laws to do what is right. And if we do what's wrong in violation of those right laws, then there are consequences that we have to suffer, and we should not get mad at the cop or the law because we violated it. We're at fault, and that's a very good point. Those things are in place for our own good because, think just on the level of traffic laws. Just think how much more dangerous the roads would be if there were no traffic laws. And you go to some third world countries who have laws in place, they say, but you watch how they drive and the chaos that's over there in these nations. When I go to Jamaica, I jokingly tell them, I said, those stop signs or red lights are suggestions for those drivers. The speed limit's just a suggestion for them. It's wild, it's chaotic. But that shows what happens in a nation when they start losing respect for law. And when that becomes a part of a national consciousness, the police are so overrun by violators, they just don't even take the time to pull people over anymore. And so that becomes the rule of the day, rebellion. So that's a good point. Laws are in place for our own good and for our own protection, and we think some laws are certainly ridiculous. I remember when I was a teenager, the seatbelt law came out. And I had just began starting to drive at that point, and I thought, that's the most ridiculous thing, government telling me I have to wear a seatbelt. But now I feel unsafe without a seatbelt on. And I know that's for my own good. As inconvenient as it seemed at the time, Now, I remember growing up as a kid, you didn't have to be in a car seat. We played around in the car all over the place and rode up front with Mom in her lap. But now you got to have all these car seats and all these things. But it's for the children's good, ultimately. Inconvenient, yes. But is it for the ultimate good? We were fortunate enough not to be in any accidents. And you can see how that those safety protocols put into place have reduced the number of tragedies on the road. So they're there for our good. And God's laws are there for our good to help us live this life and to get to heaven. And they're not to cause us to not have any fun. It causes us to live an abundant life so we can truly have the right type of fun and the right type of joy, and then have the joy and the happiness that's beyond our comprehension in heaven. You know? So we have to have that perspective on things. And those who, again, going back to those documentaries I was watching, a lot of them were blaming the cops and being those poor cops. They have to endure so much from people who not only violate the law, but then those who want to give the criminal every right, and then some. So they have to deal with that. And the people who were breaking the laws being arrested, they were blaming the cops. The cop did this, the cop did that. And there are some bad cops, no doubt about it. And it's good to have checks and balances, to watch these cops and to have them video recorded and see what they're doing, because when they do get out of hand, they do need to be punished, no doubt about that. But there has to be some sort of restraint on us, or we will become an unruly nation.
Shawn, I was also thinking when we were commenting on that, from the aspect of the child as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some parents can tend to overreact to being pulled over, and I would hope, whenever the day would come for maybe not to have kids, if I had my child sitting right beside me and I were to be pulled over, and they were to witness that, then that'd be a learning opportunity for them. Not for me to badmouth a police officer, of course, say, I was wrong for doing that, and I was supposed to get a ticket, and that's what happens whenever you defy authority.
So Daddy was speeding, so.
Yeah, and just fess up to it. And even for Israel, I was thinking about that as well in parallels, that it was a perpetuating problem.
Mm-hmm.
It probably continued to deteriorate, because the child would see the parents defy God or not sacrifice as they should, or offer poor sacrifices. They grow up and they do the same thing, and they probably don't think anything of it because that's what Mom and Dad did, and it kind of just continues to spawn generation after generation like that, up until you get around to this time frame, and that's where it really hits home.
Right.
And then going back to today, these women, like we're talking about this example, went to prison. If their parents had that same idea of authority, if these were mothers, perhaps even that were in prison, their child might have the same idea unless they get set on the right path as well.
Exactly. That's a very good point, because we perpetuate the problem by raising our children to be like us, and we teach our children by our example more so than our words. The word and the example have to be there, but our example speaks louder. And you put it in the context of Judah. Can you not imagine when the prophets were going along telling them they need to get rid of these idols, and they're saying, my great-grandmother worshipped Baal, and it's been passed down for generations. You telling me my grandmother's in hell? You're telling me my aunts and my uncles that have worshipped Baal all these years, this idol here has been passed down from generation to generation. You're telling me it's wrong? And so that attitude of this is something that our family has done, and now you're telling me I have to give it up? And you run into that today when you're trying to convert people. We've been in this particular church or this religion for generations, and if I leave it, I'll be condemning my relatives. That attitude. No. where your relatives are is irrelevant to what you will do. And what your relatives would want you to do is obey the truth no matter where they are. Whether they're in paradise or torment, they're going to want you to obey the truth when you find it. So we need to help people realize their individual responsibility, and sometimes lifelong commitments due to family loyalty has to be given up. And we have to readjust our thinking in line with God's will. And that's what the prophets were trying to do. And that's why they met with so much resistance. Okay, let's finish up the chapter. Very good discussion. Verse 19, I called for my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and my elders breathed their last in the city while they sought food to restore their life. See, O Lord, or O Yahweh, that I am in distress. My soul is troubled. My heart is overturned within me. For I have been very rebellious. Outside the sword bereaves. At home it is like death. Verse 21. They have heard that I sigh, but no one comforts me. All my enemies have heard of my trouble. They are glad that you have done it. Bring on the day you have announced, that they may become like me. Let all the wickedness come before you, and do to them as you have done to me. For all my transgression, for my sighs are many, and my heart is faint. Notice what it says there in verse 19. I called for my lovers, but they deceived me. And that's referring to the ones, spiritually speaking, that Jerusalem was having adultery with, the idols, the false religion. When the Babylonians were coming, they were praying to their idols, but no help came from the idol. I called for my lovers, but they deceived me. So the personification here of Jerusalem is that look at what has happened. I have been deceived. It's my own fault. This tragedy has come upon me, and the nations around about me are glad to see that. And then in verse 22, it ends by saying, let all their wickedness come before you, and do to them as you have done to me. In other words, you punish those who have punished me. And of course, God said that's what He would do. The time would come when the Babylonians themselves would be punished. Be reading chapter 2 and chapter 3 for next week. Lord willing, we'll go through this 5-chapter book as we study the great lessons that are found therein.